The stars shimmered coldly above Earth as a massive fleet of ships appeared out of the darkness. The Empire of Valora had arrived. Their fleet, enormous and intimidating, filled the sky like a shadow. These were no ordinary invaders. The Valora Empire had conquered countless worlds, bringing entire species to their knees. Their warriors were known across the galaxy for their unbeatable strength, their terrifying weapons, and their ruthless ways. Commander Thrax of the Valora fleet stood at the front of his flagship, staring at the blue planet below. He was tall, imposing, with sharp features that mirrored the coldness of his heart. To him, this mission was simple: another world to take, another victory to add to the Empire's long list of conquests. He had heard the rumors about Earth, that it was full of primitive humans who had barely advanced beyond their Stone Age. Their technology was laughable, their armies non-existent. Thrax had no doubt that his warriors would crush them without breaking a sweat. But then, there was that strange message they had received. The message was short and direct. "Send your best. We have our worst." Thrax had laughed at it. Humans trying to sound brave in the face of certain defeat. How could they possibly stand against the Empire's might? As the Valora fleet descended into Earth's atmosphere, they encountered no resistance. No fighter jets in the sky, no military defenses, just the soft hum of Earth's natural beauty. It was almost too easy. The landing was smooth. The warriors were eager to get started. But then, as they set foot on the ground, something strange caught their attention. The Earth was quiet, eerily quiet. No sound of battle. No screams, just the sound of their own footsteps. Thrax raised an eyebrow. Where were the humans? His warriors moved forward, weapons at the ready. The air was thick with tension. They had been sent to show the humans their place in the universe, beneath the Empire's boot. But there was a feeling in the air that made Thrax uneasy. That's when they saw him. A single human stood in front of them. He was tall, dressed in dirty overalls, and his hands were covered in grease. He looked like someone who had spent his life working with machines, not fighting wars. He didn't look like much, but there was something about him. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he looked angry. The warrior in front of Thrax laughed. "Is this your best?" He sneered, pointing at the mechanic. A human without a weapon, standing against the Empire's might. The mechanic's eyes narrowed, and Thrax could see the fire behind them. This wasn't fear. This wasn't submission. It was something else. "I've got a wrench," the mechanic said, holding it up. His voice was calm, but thick with a hint of challenge. "And that's all I need." The warriors chuckled, but Thrax wasn't so sure. There was something in the way the mechanic spoke, something that made him pause. But it wasn't enough to stop him. They had come here to show Earth what true power looked like, and no mechanic was going to change that. "Kill him," Thrax ordered. "Make an example of him." The warriors charged forward. They were fast, efficient, and armed with the most advanced weapons known to the galaxy. But as they closed in on the mechanic, something strange happened. One of the warriors raised his blaster to fire, but the weapon malfunctioned, sparks flying from it. Another warrior swung his energy blade, but it fizzled out midair. Thrax's soldiers looked confused, their weapons failing for no reason. The mechanic simply stood there, holding his wrench, as though he had expected this. "Did you really think you could conquer a planet without dealing with its machines first?" The mechanic said with a smirk. "I know exactly how your weapons work, and I know exactly how to break them." The warriors looked at each other, growing more nervous. How was this possible? They had never encountered a species that could disable their technology so easily. Thrax's frustration grew. He had sent his best warriors to Earth, and yet this mechanic was holding them back with nothing but a wrench and a few simple tricks. He had underestimated humanity, and that was a mistake he would not make again. "This human is no ordinary mechanic," Thrax muttered to himself. "There's more to him than meets the eye." But what could one angry mechanic do against the full might of the Valor Empire? The warriors slowly began to regain their composure, but the damage had already been done. The mechanic had shown them that Earth wasn't as helpless as they had thought. It wasn't a world to be conquered easily. And now the Valor Empire had to face the reality. They might not be the ones in control after all. The battle had just begun. The Empire of Valora had never faced an enemy quite like this. Their warriors, proud and powerful, stood dumbfounded in front of the mechanic. It wasn't just that his wrench had disabled their weapons. It was the way he had done it. So simple, yet so effective. No one had seen it coming. Commander Thrax clenched his fists in anger. He had come to Earth expecting an easy victory. But instead, this single human had already disrupted his plans. His warriors, who had struck fear into the hearts of entire galaxies, now seemed powerless against a mechanic with no apparent weapon. "Get him," Thrax ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. His warriors, still struggling to regain their composure, charged again. This time, they were careful. They would not underestimate the human again. The mechanic, Jack the Wrench Anderson, didn't move an inch. He didn't even look afraid. His dirty hands gripped the wrench with confidence, as though it were an extension of himself. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Empire might overwhelm him with sheer numbers. But then Jack did something unexpected. With a sharp movement, he dropped to one knee, narrowly avoiding a blast from one of the warriors. The energy beam hit the ground behind him, sending a shower of dirt into the air. As the dust settled, Jack stood up, his eyes never leaving his enemies. "You're going to need more than fancy weapons to take me down," he muttered under his breath. The warriors hesitated, but Thrax wasn't about to let this mechanic get away again. He waved his hand, signaling his elite troops to circle around Jack. They were trained to fight in any condition, against any threat. This human wouldn't stand a chance. Jack, however, was no stranger to difficult situations. He had spent his entire life fixing machines, repairing vehicles, and solving problems. And this problem was no different. In fact, it might be the most important problem he'd ever solved. As the warriors closed in, Jack's eyes darted around, scanning his surroundings. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for Earth, and he wasn't going to let some alien empire take everything he cared about. One of the warriors lunged at him, a plasma blade raised high. Jack sidestepped at the last moment, grabbing a metal pipe from the ground. With a swift motion, he jabbed the pipe into the warrior's exposed side. The warrior's armor crumpled, and the warrior let out a yelp of surprise. The force of the strike sent him crashing into a nearby wall. Another warrior moved in, but this time, Jack was ready. He swung his wrench like a hammer, hitting the warrior's arm with enough force to knock the weapon out of his hand. The warrior staggered back, shocked by the human's strength. "How?" the warrior gasped, clutching his arm. Jack didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly, using the terrain to his advantage. The warriors, skilled as they were, had no idea how to handle a fight like this. They were used to facing organized armies, not a lone human with nothing but his wits and a wrench. Thrax watched the scene unfold, his frustration mounting. His warriors were losing. They had faced battles on 100 worlds, but none of those worlds had been like this. None of those battles had been against a single mechanic who seemed to have the upper hand every step of the way. "Do not let him escape," Thrax ordered, his voice rising with anger. But Jack wasn't trying to escape. He was fighting back with every ounce of his strength, and it was working. He grabbed one of the warriors' blasters and used it against them, firing a shot into the sky to distract them. As they turned to look, Jack sprinted behind them, knocking out their communication devices with a few well-placed hits. The Valora warriors were becoming desperate. Their once perfect formations were falling apart. They had trained their whole lives to be unbeatable, but this human was showing them something they weren't prepared for: resourcefulness, ingenuity, and a fury that burned right. Jack's movements were almost like a dance. He wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was taking apart the Velora's sophisticated technology, piece by piece, rendering their weapons useless. With each strike, he showed them just how much they had underestimated humanity. They may have had advanced technology, but Jack had something they didn't: knowledge. He knew how things worked, and that knowledge made him dangerous. As the battle continued, Thrax saw something that made his blood run cold. His warriors, once fearless and relentless, were now retreating. They had never experienced anything like this before. They had never faced an enemy who didn't rely on brute force, but instead used the very machines they trusted against them. In the midst of the chaos, Jack stood tall. His clothes were torn, his body bruised, but his eyes burned with determination. He wasn't going to let the Empire destroy his world. Thrax's eyes narrowed as he watched the mechanic. This human was no ordinary being. He was something more, something the Empire hadn't prepared for. "Enough," Thrax muttered, his voice low but filled with menace. "We will not lose to a mechanic." But Jack didn't hear him. He was already moving again, his wrench raised high, ready to deliver another blow. He was far from finished, and the Empire had only begun to realize just how much trouble they were in. This part deepens the tension between Jack and the Empire, highlighting his resourcefulness and the growing fear among the Velora warriors. It sets the stage for even more challenges ahead as the mechanic continues to outsmart them at every turn. The battle had shifted. The once confident Velora warriors, each one stronger and more formidable than the last, were now struggling against a single human mechanic with nothing more than a wrench, a few stolen weapons, and sheer determination. Their advanced technology, their carefully crafted battle plans, and their tactical superiority had all been rendered useless. They were losing to a human, and it wasn't just frustrating, it was humiliating. Commander Thrax watched from a distance, his anger growing with each passing second. His soldiers had failed. He had underestimated Earth, its inhabitants, and most importantly, this mechanic. He had come here expecting a quick conquest, but now he was facing an enemy he couldn't understand. Thrax knew that if he didn't do something drastic, the entire invasion would fail. He turned to his tactical officer, who stood nervously by his side. "Get me a squad of elite soldiers," Thrax growled. "It's time to end this." The officer nodded quickly, darting off to carry out the order. But in the meantime, the mechanic, Jack Anderson, was continuing to dismantle the Velora forces, one warrior at a time. He moved with precision, using every scrap of knowledge he had accumulated over the years to disable their weapons, sabotage their armor, and outmaneuver them in every way possible. Jack had never been one for grand speeches or heroics. He was just a simple mechanic, a man who fixed things. But today, he wasn't just fixing machines. He was dismantling an entire empire. Each wrench strike, each strategic move, was another victory for humanity. He had learned something about the Velora during the fight. Their weapons were incredible, no doubt, but they had one major flaw. They relied too heavily on technology. The mechanics of their ships, their blasters, and their armor were all intricately designed. But they were also incredibly vulnerable to someone who understood machines on a deeper level. And Jack Anderson, with his years of experience working with everything from cars to heavy machinery, understood those machines like no one else. As one warrior lunged at him, Jack threw himself to the side, using his wrench to knock the blaster from the enemy's hand. With a swift move, he disabled a communication device on the warrior's chest, leaving him unable to call for backup. Jack smirked, watching as the warrior tried to react, but his movements were slow. Without his advanced technology, he was just a person who couldn't fight a mechanic. Jack's eyes scanned the battlefield. The warriors had scattered, some trying to regroup, others retreating. But no matter where they went, Jack was always one step ahead. His mind worked quickly, calculating every move, every weakness. He could feel the Empire's grip slipping. It wasn't just that their warriors were losing, It was that they were starting to realize they were fighting a battle they couldn't win. But as Jack took a breath, preparing for the next wave, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Deploy the elites," Thrax's voice boomed from a nearby platform. A chill ran down Jack's spine. The elites were the Valora Empire's top warriors, larger, faster, and stronger than any soldier. These were the soldiers who had been specially trained for the most difficult missions, the ones who had crushed entire worlds with little more than their fists and their weapons. And now, they were coming for him. Jack didn't have time to prepare. The ground rumbled as the first of the elites landed, their boots thudding heavily on the earth. They were tall, muscular, and armored from head to toe in advanced combat gear. Their eyes glowed with a cold, calculating rage. They were no longer just soldiers. They were predators. The first elite charge, a huge armored figure wielding an enormous energy blade. The blade crackled with power as it hummed through the air, aimed straight at Jack. The mechanic didn't hesitate. He dodged the first swing and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding a second strike. The ground exploded where the blade landed, sending a shockwave through the air. "Not bad," Jack muttered to himself, jumping to his feet. He had been trained for hand-to-hand combat in his youth, but this was different. The elites were trained killers, and their weapons could cut through anything. He had to outsmart them. He had to think fast. The battle had escalated beyond anything Jack Anderson could have imagined. What began as a simple fight for survival had turned into a one-man war against the might of the Valora Empire. Each moment seemed like a turning point, but with the elites now in play, Jack knew he could no longer rely on mere tricks or quick thinking alone. This was going to be the hardest fight of his life. As the dust from the last explosion settled, Jack glanced over at the wreckage of the elite warrior. He had done it. He had brought down one of the most feared soldiers in the Valora Empire. But there was no time to rest. Thrax's voice echoed through the air, filled with fury. "Prepare the final assault." Thrax shouted, his words booming across the battlefield. "We have underestimated this human for too long. It ends now." More figures began to appear, this time, not warriors but something else. Behind the fallen elite soldiers, a new group of beings stepped forward. These weren't just soldiers. They were generals, the highest-ranking officers of the Valora army. Their armor gleamed with an intimidating sheen, and their weapons were more advanced than anything Jack had encountered so far. The final assault had begun. Thrax stood high above the battlefield on a command platform, watching as his last line of defense, the generals, prepared for battle. They were skilled in every type of combat imaginable, armed with weapons that could tear through the toughest armor. If Jack had thought the elites were dangerous, he was about to see something far worse. Jack's mind raced. He had no chance against these new enemies in a direct confrontation. He needed to find a way to outsmart them, to turn the tide. His wrench was still in his hand, but it was starting to feel like a small tool in a fight that had grown beyond his ability to fix things. Still, he wasn't about to back down. He couldn't, not with Earth's future on the line. The generals moved with precision, each one taking a position to box him in. They didn't need to charge in like the elites had. They knew what they were doing, and Jack knew, too, that this was not just another fight. It was the final test. The Empire would throw everything it had at him now. This was their last chance to defeat humanity. Jack took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any advantage. He noticed the terrain around him. Once a wasteland of rubble, it now seemed like an opportunity. He spotted a pile of abandoned machines and scrap metal. With a quick look over his shoulder, he dashed towards it, using his knowledge of mechanics to quickly improvise a defense. The generals followed his every move, but Jack was ready. As they advanced, Jack set off a chain reaction. He had rigged a few of the old machines to explode with a small electrical charge. The explosion was deafening, sending a shockwave through the ground. For a moment, the battlefield was clouded with smoke and debris. Jack didn't wait for the dust to settle. He was already moving again, grabbing another weapon from the wreckage. He had learned something from his earlier battles. The Valora Empire's greatest weakness wasn't their weapons or their size. It was their overconfidence. They thought their technology made them invincible, but it had its flaws. And those flaws were the key to his success. One of the generals emerged from the smoke, wielding a massive energy blade that crackled with raw power. Jack didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, using the blaster he had taken from an earlier warrior to fire a concentrated beam at the general's weak spot, the joint in the armor near the shoulder. The shot hit its mark, causing the general to stagger back in pain. Before the general could react, Jack was on him, using his wrench to land a powerful blow on the weakened spot. The general's armor cracked, and the once imposing warrior fell to the ground, defeated. Jack's heart raced. He could feel the tide of the battle shifting. But it wasn't over yet. The remaining generals were closing in, and they weren't going to make the same mistake twice. One of the generals moved with lightning speed, dodging Jack's attack and landing a brutal punch that sent Jack flying across the battlefield. The force of the blow left him gasping for air, but he didn't stay down. He couldn't afford to. Not now. He pushed himself to his feet, feeling the weight of his body as it ached from the constant battle. But there was something else driving him, something deeper. His planet, his people. Earth wasn't just another world to be conquered. It was home, and Jack Anderson would not let it fall without a fight. The battlefield was eerily silent. Smoke hung in the air, the remnants of explosions and broken machines scattered across the field. The once imposing Valora Empire's warriors, those who had been sent to crush Earth, lay defeated, their bodies sprawled across the war-torn ground. And in the midst of it all stood Jack Anderson, the human mechanic, bloodied but unbowed. He panted heavily, his body sore from the relentless battle, but his eyes burned with a fierce resolve. The Valora Empire, the greatest military power in the galaxy, had sent their best and their brightest. They had sent their generals, their elites, their finest warriors, and every single one of them had fallen before him. But it wasn't just the soldiers that were defeated. No, something much deeper had been shattered. The Valora Empire's sense of superiority had crumbled. Their belief that they were untouchable, their confidence that no species could stand against them, had been shattered by a single human mechanic wielding nothing more than a wrench. Above him, Commander Thrax stood on his command platform, watching in stunned silence. His face was a mask of disbelief and seething anger. His fleet was in disarray. His soldiers were broken. The invasion, which had seemed so certain, had failed. It was the kind of failure that could not be easily ignored. And worse, it was a failure that threatened the Empire itself. Thrax's voice crackled through the comm system, his tone low and dangerous. This is not over. The Empire will not be humiliated by a single human. We will return, and you will be crushed. Jack didn't even flinch. He had heard enough of the Empire's threats. He had seen enough of their arrogance. Now, all that was left was the truth. Humanity had won. Not because they had better technology, not because they were superior in any way, but because they had something the Empire had never considered: the will to fight back. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack replied, his voice steady. "And neither is Earth." Thrax seethed, his frustration clear. But there was no denying it. Jack Anderson had proven that the Valora Empire was not invincible. Humans were not just diplomats, not just pawns in the galaxy's grand game. They were something far more dangerous. Jack turned away from the battlefield and began to walk toward the wreckage of the Valora's command ship. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. The war was over, for now, at least. The Empire had been humiliated, and Jack, the mechanic who had turned the tide, had made a statement. He was tired, more than he had ever been in his life, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that he had done what needed to be done. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson today. Humanity wasn't just another species to be conquered. They were apex predators, survivors who would never bow to anyone. Behind him, the remaining Valora forces began to retreat, their ships lifting off, leaving the battlefield empty. The once mighty empire, shaken to its core, was forced to reconsider its view of humanity. And as their ships disappeared into the sky, Jack stood alone, the only human on a world that had just proven its strength to the universe. He looked out over the horizon, the dust beginning to settle, and let out a long breath. "This isn't over," he whispered to himself. "This is just the beginning." In the last scene, the final confrontation between Jack Anderson and the Valora Empire ends in a resounding victory for humanity. The Empire is forced to retreat, humiliated by a single human mechanic who has proven that no matter how advanced the enemy, humanity will always find a way to fight back. Jack's victory is not just physical. It's a statement to the galaxy that Earth will never be an easy target. The story closes with a sense of triumph, but also a foreboding hint that the battle may not be truly over. The future of Earth remains uncertain, but humanity has shown it will never back down.